farewell address, including and shaped by his reaction to the French Revolution. So let's go to the first point for tonight, and that is the French Revolution as viewed by Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine, of course. So here's a photo of Burke. Edmund Burke is claimed by many to be the father of conservatism. And yet even some liberals claim Burke. He's an interesting character for many reasons. And one of those is that as a member of the House of Commons for 29 years, he was really a defender for the American colonies and eventually was willing to concede that they should be independent. So there's a lot going for Burke in terms of Americans. But we're going to look at it later on as well and ask about his rhetoric, because he was a great statesman, yes, and he wrote a lot, but he's also a great speaker. And that's very important, as we'll see in the following selection that I'm going to take from a summary of Burke's position and his importance. So this selection is from the American Conservative. Let me read this piece that was created by Peter Stanlis, Dr. Peter Stanlis. Burke's electrifying maiden speech in Parliament, given in January 1766, urged repeal the Stamp Act. So right out of the box, he's taking the side of the American colonies. That catapulted him to national fame. From beginning to end, Burke's main purpose regarding Britain's colonies was to preserve and harmonize American liberty and British sovereignty. He was convinced that the conflict between Britain and America resulted from imprudent actions by the British government, including taxing the colonies without their consent. So what Burke's position is important is to show that the American view wasn't just one-sided. That is, a prominent member of the House of Commons basically was saying that the British government, which he very much supported, was nevertheless acting imprudently in a way that was hurting the relationship with the colonies. So back to text. All were unsuccessful attempts to persuade the king, that is, the letters and speeches he gave, his ministers, the majority in Parliament, and the British public of the folly of England's policy towards the colonies and the great danger in attempting to coerce Americans into obedience. Now, we're going to continue with this piece from Peter Stanlis. Burke never believed that the colonies sought independence on speculative or ideological theories of absolute rights. That's going to be important in terms of Burke's consistency and his opposition to the French Revolution, pointing out that the American Revolution and the French Revolution are very different. But rather that they rebelled as disaffected subjects of Britain who wished to preserve their constitutional rights. And the constitutional rights of Englishmen, we've seen before and will emphasize again, are very different than the abstract rights of man. As the War of Rebellion continued, Burke became convinced that the colonies were lost to Britain, and he was among the first to willingly grant independence to the colonies. Burke is really non-ideological. What do I mean by that? He doesn't have a clearly outlined system of political theory. What he has are principles, certain key principles, and it's heavily grounded in history and tradition, nature and natural law. All of that is in a mix. It's not something you write out or that he wrote out in a systematic way. And for this reason, different people can find different things in Burke, makes him rather fascinating in that sense. What we want to focus on is his work, the reflections on the revolution, the French Revolution. Now, this may not be his most comprehensive book or the one best to illustrate his thinking, but it's the one for which he is most well known. In this book, he is attacking the whole notion of abstract rights of man. Why is this important to us? Well, because the French Declaration on the Rights of Man, along with the American Declaration, become the basis for modern discussions of human rights post-Second World War, America and the world. And we have a tendency to go towards the abstractions rather than the historical understanding of the rights involved. Burke predicted, first of all, Burke actually supported the revolution initially until he realized with the Declaration of the Rights of Man that these were not like the Americans at all. These were very abstract. And that at that point, he turned against it and started to attack what was going on in France, and quite visibly realized that it was not going to end well. It was going to end in violence. So let's go now to our first excerpt from Burkes Reflections.
You will observe from Magna Carta to the Declaration of Right, it has been the uniform policy of our Constitution to claim and assert our liberties as an entailed inheritance derived to us from our forefathers and to be transmitted to our posterity, as an estate specifically belonging to the people of this kingdom, without any reference whatever to any other more general or prior right. By this means our Constitution preserves a unity in so great a diversity of its parts. We have an inheritable crown, an inheritable peerage, and a House of Commons, and a people inheriting privileges, franchises, and liberties from a long line of ancestors.
Burke is stressing inheritance. That is, it's a long line, it's historical, it is traditional, it is not abstract. That's the whole point of this part of its reflections.
But the age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. Never, never more shall we behold that generous loyalty to rank and sex, that proud submission, that dignified obedience, that subordination of the heart, which kept alive, even in servitude itself, the spirit of exalted freedom. The unbought grace of life, the cheap defense of nations, the nurse of manly sentiment and heroic enterprise, is gone. It is gone, that sensibility of principle, that chastity of honor, which felt a stain like a wound, which inspired courage whilst it mitigated ferocity, which ennobled whatever it touched, and under which vice itself lost half its evil by losing all its grossness.
That's one of the most famous lines from Burke about the age of chivalry is gone, and then the age now of sophisters, meaning false reasoners, sophists, economists, and calculators, accountants. Yeah, that's the age we live in. We've lived in it for a long time. Question really is, how can conservatives use Burkean rhetoric to deal with the Revolution of France, which in many ways is still with us? So when you read from sections of the Rights of Man, you easily can see why Paine was welcomed into France, even though he couldn't speak any French. Let's read.
As Mr. Burke occasionally applies the poison drawn from his horrid principles, not only to the English nation, but to the French Revolution and the National Assembly, and charges that august, illuminated, and illuminating body of men with the epithet of usurpers, I shall, sans cérémonie, place another system of principles in opposition to his. The English Parliament of 1688 did a certain thing which, for themselves and their constituents, they had a right to do, and which it appeared right should be done. But in addition to this right, which they possessed by delegation, they set up another right, by assumption, that of binding and controlling posterity to the end of time. The case, therefore, divides itself into two parts: the right which they possess by delegation, and the right which they set by assumption. The first is admitted, but with respect to the second, I reply there never did, there never will, and there never can exist a parliament or any description of men or any generation of men in any country possessed of the right or the power of binding and controlling posterity to the quote, end of time, or of commanding forever how the world shall be governed, or who shall govern it. And therefore all such clauses, acts, or declarations by which the makers of them attempt to do what they have neither the right nor the power to do, nor the power to execute, are in themselves null and void. Every age and generation must be as free to act for itself in all cases as the age and generations which preceded it. The vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave is the most ridiculous and insolent of all tyrannies. Man has no property in man, neither has any generation a property in the generations which are to follow. The Parliament or the people of 1688, or of any other period, had no more right to dispose of the people of the present day, or to bind or to control them in any shape whatever, than the Parliament or the people of the present day have to dispose of, bind, or control those who are to live 100 or 1,000 years hence. Every generation is and must be competent to all the purposes which its occasions require. It is the living and not the dead that are to be accommodated. When man ceases to be, his power and his wants cease with him. And having no longer any participation in the concerns of this world, he has no longer any authority in directing who shall be its governors, or how its government shall be organized, or how administered.
There's a certain attractiveness to what Paine is saying, with the notion that every generation is free to start over again. But when you think about it, it means scrapping everything that there is in place, at least the notion that you have a right to do that. Only in the French Revolution and revolutions like it since has that been attempted. The key to our Constitution, which Paine could not really have liked, is that it allows both. It allows a certain permanence in the Constitution with the ability to change quite a bit through the legislative process. As radical as Paine seems to be, he's not that radical compared to the real radicals in the French Revolution. And why is that important? Paine is really inconsistent with our Constitution. But these people who are the radicals in France and who have a great deal of influence around the world, indeed, all of the revolutions basically since the French Revolution have been driven or find their roots in the French Revolution, including the Bolshevik Revolution and the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And some would say even our own counter-cancel revolution. So we're now about to transition to Washington. And remember, Washington used the writing of Paine to inspire his troops, that is, from the crisis. But that doesn't mean that he is agreeing with Paine on the French Revolution. It's going to be quite the opposite of that. Washington not only doesn't support the French Revolution, he has to deal with it and work against it.